Do you remember Blatten? If you watched what happened in that narrow alpine valley in Switzerland just over a year ago, you already know that a warning can be loud enough to save 300 lives and still leave the scientists who issued it admitting they did not fully understand what they were watching. The glacier came down in 40 seconds. 9 million cubic meters of rock, mud, and ice moving at 200 kilometers an hour. A village that had stood for centuries was gone before the dust settled. The evacuation had worked, the people were safe, and the world called it a success story and moved on. But the scientists did not move on, because just a few kilometers up the same valley, a second glacier has now begun showing the exact same signs that the Birch Glacier showed in the weeks before it failed. The same categories of early warning, and the same anomalies in satellite data and field observations, the same signals that a team of expert glaciologists watched develop in real time at Blatten, and still could not predict the hour of collapse. If you live anywhere near a glaciated mountain range, if you have family in Switzerland, in the Alps, in the Andes, in the Himalayas, in Alaska, or if you simply want to understand what thawing permafrost is doing to the mountains above millions of people right now, you need to watch this full video, because what is developing in the Lechontal Valley is not a local story. It is a preview of something that is accelerating across every major mountain range on Earth. And the scientists watching it are being more honest than they usually are about how much they still do not know. Before we get to what is happening right now, you need to understand exactly what Blatten was, because the word glacier carries a specific image in most people's minds. Something slow, something that retreats over decades in a smooth and manageable way, a gentle disappearance that gives communities time to adjust. What happened at Blatten on May 28, 2025, was the opposite of that image in every possible way. The Lechontal is a narrow glacial valley in the canton of Valais in southern Switzerland. For centuries, it was one of the most isolated and deeply traditional valleys in the entire Alps. Snow-capped peaks, streams of clear meltwater running over stone, wooden chalets that had stood for generations and passed from parent to child across hundreds of years. At the head of the valley sat Blatten, a village of approximately 300 people, the kind of place where families could trace their roots in the church records back 5 and 6 centuries. Not a vacation destination, a home, a community built into the mountain itself over generations. Above the village rose the Birch Glacier, and above the glacier rose a peak called the Kleines Nesthorn, a complex mass of gneiss and amphibolite, the kind of hard crystalline rock that forms the spine of the Alps and that has been stable for thousands of years. The key word there is has been, because in the weeks before the collapse, something that had held the mountain together for millennia was no longer holding. This next part matters. High in the mountains, the rock itself is held together not just by its own density and structure, but by something you cannot see from the surface. Permafrost. Frozen water locked deep inside the cracks and joints of the bedrock. Ice that has been solid for thousands of years, acting as a natural adhesive that binds fractured mountain faces into stable masses. Remove that ice, and a rock face that, as the climate warms, high-altitude permafrost is thawing. Not everywhere at once, not uniformly, and not on any schedule that monitoring instruments can predict with precision. But the process is real, it is documented, and it is accelerating. At the Kleines Nesthorn, thawing permafrost loosened the rock face above the Birch Glacier in the weeks leading up to May 2025. Swiss authorities were watching it happen almost in real time. And their response, the speed and decisiveness of what came next, is the single reason this is not a story of catastrophic human loss. On May 17, 2025, and that single image moved the entire country, and then everyone waited. For 9 days, the mountain held. Nothing catastrophic moved. And in those 9 days, something very human happened. People began to hope. Maybe the models had been too cautious. Maybe the worst had been avoided. Maybe they would be allowed to go home. It is worth understanding what that waiting feels like. The scientists could not promise anything. They could only say that the mountain was unstable and that the safest place was anywhere but the valley floor. The evacuees were not in danger, but they were watching the clock and wondering whether the home their family had occupied for generations would still be there at the end of it. Then, on May 28, 2025, the Birch Glacier gave way almost in its entirety. In approximately 40 seconds, more than 9 million cubic meters of rock, mud, and ice surged down the slope at roughly 200 kilometers an hour. The debris flow slammed into the valley floor, blocked the Lanza River, formed a new lake behind the rubble, and raised the immediate threat of downstream flooding. One man, a 64-year-old shepherd who was outside the evacuation zone, did not survive. The early warning had protected 300 people, but approximately 90% of Blatten was destroyed. The damage estimate reached around 255 million Swiss francs. An entire community, centuries in the making, gone in well under a minute. Here is why this is serious. The glaciologists, who had been watching the Birch Glacier in the days and hours before it failed, had been very specific about something in the aftermath. They could see clearly that the system was failing. They could document the accelerating movement of the ice, the increasing rockfall, the structural deterioration of the glacier surface. What they could not do was say when. The near-total breakup, when it came, still arrived as a surprise to the very experts who were watching it on their screens in real time expecting it. That is not a failure of the monitoring system. The monitoring system worked. That is an honest statement about the limits of what science can currently predict about these events, and it is the context that makes what is happening right now in the same valley deeply important. Now the focus shifts to the second glacier. Its name is the Usre-Chimli Glacier. It sits above the hamlet of Fafleralp, just a few kilometers up the Leuchtental Valley from the ruins of Blatten. Over recent months, satellite data combined with field observations conducted by glaciologists in Valais have detected what Swiss authorities are carefully calling isolated collapses and anomalies on this glacier. Those are precise words chosen deliberately. They fall into the same categories of early warning signals that preceded the failure of the Birch Glacier. Not identical. Not a guaranteed repetition of what happened at Blatten, but close enough in character that the authorities have already taken action. The road between Stumpach and Fafleralp has been closed as a precaution. A popular hiking trail in the upper valley has been shut down. The reopening of tourism in that section of the Leuchtental has been delayed. The area above the destroyed village has become once again a watch zone, monitored continuously by the same instruments and the same scientific teams that tracked the Birch Glacier to its end. The Swiss monitoring apparatus, which performed exactly as it was designed to perform at Blatten, is now turned toward a second target in the same valley. Most people are missing this. The international coverage of Blatten treated it as a contained event. A tragedy, yes. A dramatic rescue success, certainly. But a singular occurrence, something that happened in one specific place under one specific set of conditions, unlikely to repeat. That framing was always incomplete. The process that destroyed Blatten, thawing permafrost, destabilizing high-altitude rock faces above glaciers that are themselves changing under the pressure of climatic shifts, is not singular. It is systemic. It is operating across every major glaciated mountain range on Earth simultaneously. And in the Leuchtental, it is now operating on a second glacier in the same valley within 12 months of the first. Think about what that means for the scientists who are watching the Usre-Chimli right now. They are the same teams, in many cases the same individuals, who issued the warning at Blatten, who watched the mountain for 9 days while evacuees waited, who saw the collapse happen in real time, on their instruments, and still found its timing and completeness surprising. They are now watching a second system in the same valley show the same early signals. They are doing exactly what the science demands, which is monitoring carefully, communicating honestly about uncertainty, and taking precautionary action without making promises they cannot keep. An honest scientist has to be very careful here. The Usre-Chimli area is largely uninhabited. Fafleralp is a small hamlet, not a village of 300 residents with centuries of continuous occupation. The signals detected so far are anomalies and early warnings, not the announcement of an imminent collapse. Detecting warning signs is genuinely not the same thing as predicting an event. The scientific teams watching this glacier are not saying a second Blatten is about to happen. They are saying that this glacier is showing the kind of early behavior that demands attention, that precautionary measures are appropriate, and that the situation will be monitored continuously. But that careful scientific uncertainty is precisely what makes this moment so important to understand. Because the Blatten warning was also careful. The language used in the days before May 28th was also measured and precise and honest about what was known and what was not. The evacuation was ordered not because scientists were certain the glacier would collapse, but because the risk profile had crossed the threshold where precautionary action was the only responsible choice, and the glacier collapsed anyway, in 40 seconds, in a way that still surprised the people who were watching it. Mountain permafrost is thawing across every major glaciated range on Earth. The exact same process that loosened the rock above Blatten is at work right now in the and as above growing cities in Peru, in cities and valleys throughout the Himalayas, in Nepal, India, and Pakistan, where sudden glacial floods already threaten entire communities, in Alaska, and in the mountains of western Canada. In 2022, a chunk of the Marmolada Glacier in the Italian Dolomites broke off during a heat wave and swept through a popular hiking area with severe human consequences. The danger is not that one Swiss valley is uniquely vulnerable. The danger is that high-altitude mountain landscapes everywhere are entering a phase of instability that our historical experience of these environments simply did not prepare us for. The families who were evacuated from Blatten last May are still not home. They cannot go home because there is no home to return to. They are living in temporary accommodation, in the homes of relatives, in rented apartments in other villages, while discussions continue about whether and how and where a new community might be built, and whether the valley above the ruins is stable enough to permit anything at all. The question of whether people should be allowed to rebuild in a place like Blatten is not a simple one. The land has cultural meaning that stretches back half a millennium. The connection between those families and that valley is not something that can be replaced by finding a safer location on a map. But the mountain that buried their village is still there. The permafrost above it is still thawing. And now the glacier, just a few kilometers further up the same valley, is beginning to show the same signs. What happened next changed the global conversation about mountain risk assessment. Following the Blatten event, glaciologists and geohazard specialists from Switzerland and across Europe convened to share data, compare monitoring approaches, and assess which other high-altitude glacier systems might be approaching similar thresholds of instability. The number of systems flagged for enhanced observation increased significantly. Switzerland alone identified multiple sites where the combination of permafrost degradation, increased rockfall onto glacier surfaces, and accelerating ice movement created a risk profile worth sustained monitoring attention. The Usra Chemli was among them, and now, less than a year after Blatten, it is producing the signals that put it at the top of that list. The Swiss early warning system that saved 300 lives at Blatten is a genuine achievement. It represents decades of investment in monitoring infrastructure and scientific expertise in the institutional will to act on uncertain data before certainty arrives. But one of the glaciologists studying these slopes has described the current situation in the Alps as new and unexplored terrain. The phrase was chosen carefully. Every mountain behaves differently. No two glacier collapses are quite alike. The monitoring systems are better than they have ever been. The scientific understanding of permafrost dynamics is deeper than it has ever been. And even with all of that, the scientists who watched Blatten fall in real time on their instruments were still surprised by the completeness and the speed of the collapse. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting beneath the success. The monitoring worked. The evacuation worked. The people survived. And the collapse still came as a surprise to the people who were best prepared for it. That gap between what the instruments can measure and what the models can predict and what the mountain will actually do is not a gap that more funding or better technology can currently close. It is a fundamental limit of what science can know about complex geological systems operating under conditions that have no precise historical parallel. The Usre Chamli Glacier is being watched right now. The instruments are running, the satellite passes are being analyzed, the field teams are going in where access is safe to take measurements that complement what the remote sensors cannot capture. The Swiss authorities, who closed the road, and the hiking trail are doing exactly what the Blatten experience taught them to do. They are acting early, acting cautiously, and communicating openly. They are not saying this glacier will collapse. They are saying it is showing signs that cannot be ignored, that the precautionary measures in place are appropriate, and that the situation remains under active evaluation. And almost everyone who followed the story at the time felt, at some level, that the worst had been survived, that the danger had moved on, that the Lötschental would now begin the long and painful process of recovery and rebuilding. That feeling was understandable. It was also premature, because a few kilometers up the same valley, the same forces that destroyed Blatten have been at work on a second glacier through every month of the year that has passed since. And now the Usra Chimli is speaking in the same language that the Birch Glacier spoke before it fell. The scientists are listening. The road is closed, the trails are shut, the instruments are watching. The mountain is not finished. It is only deciding what comes next. There's one more layer to this situation that almost never reaches the public conversation about glaciers and mountain risk, and it deserves direct attention. The debate about whether to rebuild Blatten is not simply a practical question about engineering and site selection. It is a question about how human communities relate to landscapes that have become genuinely unpredictable in ways they were not a generation ago. The residents of Blatten did not choose to live in a dangerous place out of ignorance or recklessness. They lived where their families had always lived. The mountain above them had been stable for as long as anyone could measure. The glacier had retreated, as glaciers across the Alps had been retreating, but it had retreated slowly and without catastrophic failure. The permafrost thaw that ultimately destroyed the village was not visible from the valley floor. It was not something the residents could observe or measure or prepare for through any local knowledge or generational experience. It required satellite data, specialized instruments, and scientific expertise that no local community can be expected to maintain independently. This is the wider truth that the Lötschental forces into view. Across the mountain regions of the world, communities have built their lives in valleys and on slopes that were stable under the climatic conditions of the past several centuries. The inherited wisdom of those communities, the knowledge of where floods had come before, where rockfalls had occurred, which slopes to avoid in spring, was calibrated to a world where the freezing and thawing cycles of high altitude. Permafrost remained within a range that had not changed dramatically in living or even recorded memory. That calibration is no longer reliable. The thresholds that permafrost maintained for millennia are shifting, And the communities living beneath glaciated peaks in Switzerland and Peru and Nepal and Alaska and Pakistan and across the broader mountain world are navigating a landscape that is changing faster than local knowledge alone can track. What happened next in the international scientific community following Blatten was a recognition, stated more openly than such things are usually stated, that the monitoring infrastructure for glaciated mountain hazards around the world is nowhere near adequate for the scale of the problem that is developing. Switzerland, one of the wealthiest and most scientifically sophisticated countries in the world, with a long tradition of investment in natural hazard monitoring and a civil protection system that is genuinely world-class, still had to watch Blatten collapse with only a probabilistic warning that could not specify the day or hour of failure. Most mountain communities at comparable or greater risk around the world have nothing approaching the monitoring capability that Switzerland deployed at Blatten. Villages in the Himalayas, in the Andes, in the Caucasus sit beneath glaciated peaks, showing the same early signs of permafrost degradation and increased rockfall with no satellite monitoring, no GPS instrumentation, no real-time alert systems, and no institutional framework capable of ordering and executing a timely evacuation. The number of people globally living in valleys and on slopes directly downstream of glaciated peaks is not a small number. Researchers working on mountain hazard risk have estimated that tens of millions of people across Asia alone live in areas exposed to glacier-related hazards, including glacial lake outburst floods, ice and rock avalanches, and the kind of large-scale glacier collapse that destroyed Blatten, a Swiss alpine village who were still nearly caught by a mountain that gave 9 days of visible warning before it fell. The Usre-Chimli Glacier is not in a remote, uninhabited wilderness. Pfäffler sits at its base, and the valley below it carries the same road that connects communities throughout the Lötschental. The closure of that road and the hiking trail above it is a precautionary measure grounded in the lesson that Blatten taught at the cost of an entire village. It is the correct response. But it is also a reminder that the correct response to a glacier showing early warning signs involves closing roads and restricting access and telling people they cannot go where they normally go, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, sometimes based on signals that ultimately resolve without a collapse. That is the cost of early action. And the alternative, the cost of late action, is measured in lives and in centuries of community erased in under a minute.